Well, hello everybody. Good evening and happy Tuesday. So tonight we start into book 3 of the Winter of the World trilogy by Michael Scott Rohan. That's right. Tonight we start The Hammer of the Sun. So, to start with, I'm going to give a quick recap, as I have been doing, of what happened in the last chapter. So the last chapters were the end of the Forge in the Forest. So we did 2 chapters on the last stream plus the appendix. The appendix I do have to redo for anybody who normally goes out to my YouTube channel to listen to it or to watch it. It's been really hot up here in New England, and I, had my air conditioner turned off. I had my window fan turned off so that way we weren't getting all of the sound in the background. Well, it kind of turns out that heat and electronic stuff don't work so well together, so my sound cut out for a little while during the stream. Thankfully, we got through chapters 10 and 11. Those are done up. Those are up on the YouTube channel for anybody to go and listen to that needs to go and catch up on them. But the appendix and the coda, we missed some of that in the middle. I had to reset the sound in the middle of it, and I was missing sound for a little while, so I am going to go back and record that, but I have not done so yet. So the appendix, for the moment, was there for anybody who happened to be on the live stream and could read it along with me at that point. So in the last stream, the last couple of chapters of the book, the Eqwesh had captured our heroes, Kermorven and Rock and Ills and Elof, and they took them into the city. Turns out that one of the guys from the West was a traitor. Well, a traitor to what they thought he should be, but he was a servant of the ice as his family line and as his, hidden fellowship had been for generations. Brihon. So they were captured. The idea was for Kara to come in and kill them, because Kara was a servant and a warrior of the powers. Well, Elof managed to use the arm ring that Kara has been wearing since the first book, and was able to get her to break free, at least temporarily, from Lohi, who had been her mistress. And once that was done, he had given her the command to kind of go out and alert the city. So they alerted the city, all the people came out, and then there was big battle. Kermorven and our heroes against the Eqwesh, with the powers on the other side. Lohi and Kara doing their best to drive the Eqwesh forward. Elof ended up besting Lohi, and then he ended up basically having a shape-shifting chase with Kara, and ended up besting her as well, and broke the chain on her feet, and was able to free her from the influence of Lohi. And so, at the end of the book, essentially we had Kermorven was the crowned lord of I want to say Morlenhall was the name that they had taken for themselves. I could be wrong on that. Um, but of that land and of those peoples, Kermorven had become the lord of it, with the other people as his advisors. And Kara and Elof got together, and when I say got together, they got together. And so, all is well, and the idea would be that all would be well. They've gotten there. They're going to have to go back to the west at some point and figure out what to do about the Ekwesh over there. But where they're at, they have defeated the Ekwesh. They've defeated Brihon. Kara has been freed and is now with Elof. And, he has his helm back. And he has the, he had destroyed the sword that he had created. He has, he has reclaimed the helmet that he had created that allowed for instant travel. That was how he did the shape-shifting, to be able to keep up with Kara. And so now we'll be moving into the Hammer of the Sun, or as they call it within the book. The last one was the Book of the Helm. This one is the Book of the Armring, which is the third of the pieces that he had put together for his journeymanship, his apprenticeship. He was an apprentice to get his journeyman badge, let's call it. So this was the third of the three that the Mastersmith, the evil Mastersmith, who was a servant of the ice, had him create. And so that is what we will move into on this book. So I want to pause here for just a moment to see if anybody who is here has any questions, any comments, any thoughts, anything on the first two books. Did you like them? Did you hate them? Is there something that you'd love that I did differently? Is this something that you think that these were great, and it's something that you'll go back and maybe listen to another time or anything like that? I'm just curious as to what your thoughts were, or any thoughts that you guys may have had about the books in general. And so I'm going to give just 30 seconds to a minute to allow you guys to chat in if you do have any questions, thoughts, comments, anything else, and I'll be happy to read them and address them as best as I can. And then I've got my AC running right now because, once again, we're under a severe heat warning here in New England. So, 'tis going to be hot again, which means I am probably only going to do one chapter no matter what tonight, because doing any more than that is probably too much for my computer, and it's too much for me. On the last one, I legitimately, I started getting lightheaded. It was so hot in here. I ended up opening my windows in the middle of the chapter as I was reading. It was insane in here. So I will probably keep myself to one chapter tonight, because this guy writes chapters that are ungodly long. I mean, they're great. I like it. It's okay. But damn if this guy does not write one hell of some chapters to it. So I will keep myself to a shorter stream with that, so that way I don't have to worry about the computer shutting down or me overheating or anything like that. Give it another couple of seconds if you guys do have any questions or comments or thoughts or anything else. And then I will go ahead and go shut off my AC and my fan, and we'll read into chapter 1. Let's see how long chapter 1 is supposed to be. All right. Going into here. I wish they would actually tell me the number of pages, but they don't. So, chapter 1 starts on location 40. Chapter 2 is location 286. So we will probably make it into at least 2 chapters then. Wonder if this is... No, this is definitely a long book. So, it must be that some of these chapters get really long as time goes on. But it looks like, this first chapter is probably relatively short. Yeah. I mean, it looks like it's probably relatively short. So if that's the case and we get through it pretty quickly, then I'll do 2 chapters. If it looks like it's running way longer than I think it is, then we'll only do the 1. All right. Well, that said, I see no questions, thoughts, comments, concerns from anybody within the stream here. So I'm going to go shut off the AC so any of that stuff is not running in the background while I record the reading of this, and then we'll get started. So excuse me just 1 moment. I will be right back. All right, everyone, here we go. Prelude. The happiness of men is fragile, for so are we made that all our gains carry within them the seeds of loss, and too often we ourselves may sow them. After the events chronicled in the Book of the Helm, many long years of such happiness awaited Elof and Kara, whom he loved, and the friends they had won. And for all he knew, in the pride and prime of his years, they might have lasted forever. But it was he himself who was to end them, in such folly as only wise men may create, and endure terrible trials in consequence. Yet from that ill sowing much else was to grow, and of that the Book of the Armring tells. Chapter 1. The Forging. It was her restlessness that roused him, the slender body beside him twisting and turning beneath the covers of heavy tapestry, admitting the keen morning air to play over his naked skin. For a moment he lay half drugged with sleep, dimly aware of a deeper chill growing within him. He knew it well, that chill, all too well of late. In part it was excitement, oddly tinged with guilt. But even more of it was fear. In sleepy anxiety he rolled over, put out an arm to enfold her, brushed her flank as she rose, and dropped on the warmth of the empty sheet. His eyes blinked open. She was stepping onto the balcony, her skin pale as the dawn sky beyond, lifting something to her shoulders. A swirl of white hit her back, fell back to her sides, its lining black as her hair. Then her outstretched arms raised the cloak in a great spreading sweep, hiding the sky. Fear stabbed him awake. He sat up, cried out. Her arms dropped, but in falling the cloak billowed out, the lining flashed, and the air whistled with the downstroke of wide black wings. A great swan surged up from the balcony and wheeled dark against the pallid airs, lifting and swooping with a lazy grace out over the sleeping rooftops and down towards the sea. He cursed and sprang from the bed, his feet tangling in the spread skins beneath, and flung aside the curtain of the aumbry behind. From its highest shelf he seized a light metal cap and clapped it onto his head. A spray of mail fell icy about his cheeks, chilled his neck as he closed it with clumsy fingers. Fear flamed in him, fear and a fire still hotter. So it was, as the tale is told, that there awoke in his heart that wish, wholly loving and yet tainted by darker and more ruthless desires, that was to turn the course and flow not of his brief existence alone, but of the whole winter of the world. He drew breath an instant, forced himself to think, while the black speck dwindled in the swelling light. An image formed in his mind. He gave it substance, shape, and as it burgeoned, a wave washed over him, a prickling surge of pain, cold and metallic, that trailed behind it a sense of vast pressures. He let fall his hands, and felt the air grow thick beneath them, a sudden urge of overwhelming power at his breast that lifted him high, higher, across the tangled bed and out over the balcony in a single thrusting embrace of the air. His legs trailed. He angled his feet in the rush to steady him as he rose. His eyes, grown newly keen, sought out the distant wing beats. Already they were out beyond the harbor. With a fierce, voiceless hiss, he angled his wings and plunged down the sky in pursuit. Below him, the ships of the great fleet rocked gently at their moorings, no one stirring on their decks, and at the sight of them a cool thread of doubt grew among Elof's anger. He threw all his strength into his wings, arced high above the sea-wall and out over the swell that heaved like the breathing of some vast monster, low but deep. Over it, now low, now high, sped Kara. But for all her speed, he was gaining. He was upon her. The shadow of his wings flickered on her back as he stooped to her. She wheeled effortlessly and rose to meet him. Level with him she flew, and passed so close that her back brushed his breast, and their flight muscles rippled together under the sleek black down. Her neck snaked against his, writhing teasingly. Then, suddenly, down ruffled against bare skin, her skin. Up and past him she surged, in woman's shape once more. But from her shoulders vast black wings still beat, and among their feathers was a single flash of gold. Startled, he threshed clumsily after her, and her laughter rang bright in his ears. He struggled to concentrate, to clothe himself in a new shape as she had, but he could not imagine himself so, could not accept the strangeness of it. He faltered, fluttered on the freshening wind, panicked, and felt the shape that masked him fall away, the rushing air chill upon his naked skin. He flailed at emptiness and dropped like a stone. The uprush took him, flung him about, showed him the steely sea sweeping up to meet him. Then it whipped him around again, and Kara filled the sky, swooping down upon him, a vision of eerie loveliness. He reached his arms out to her, and her great wings closed about him, enveloped him. He touched her, clung, and felt her legs twine around him. Her lips pressed down on his with bruising force. Her tongue flickered against his, and her breasts thrust against him with every wing beat. He hooked an arm about her heaving shoulders, caressed her with his free hand, felt the taut peak of her fierce excitement, the heart that leaped beneath. He stroked his fingers down her ribs to her flank, across her taut belly, and she threw back her head and cried out. They were rising now, the sea swaying away beneath them with every beat of the black pinions, faster and faster. He felt a surge of strength to match her own, and crushed her to him. Her back arched, her legs quivered against his. Then she folded fiercely forward and crossed them about his waist. Joined, they scaled the heights of the sky, while beneath them the horizon rolled away to reveal the sun, and they lifted into its first clear flare of gold. It blazed on Kara's pale skin as she swayed back in a tremor of delight, and to Elof's eyes she seemed to flow with a flood of molten light. Spilled over into him, rushed searing through his body, a torrent that burst into his mind and blotted out thought. He felt Kara stiffen convulsively against him, her wide wings outthrust, quivering. With the high scream of a great bird, she toppled backward in the air. They went spiraling down into emptiness, uncaring. Only in the last instant, as the sea seemed to reach up and grab at them, did Elof recover his wits. Kara gave a wild yell, then he felt a great stinging slap of cold across his back that all but drove out what little breath was left him. Water rushed into his open mouth, stung his eyes, roared in his ears. It sucked the heat from him, though his skin burned with the impact. Instinctively, he kicked out against the icy embrace, felt himself rising, and in a sudden qualm of panic, snatched for the precious helm. His fingers touched metal, and he knew it hung still fastened about his neck. It was no greater relief when an instant later he burst through the surface and could draw breath. Gasping, he clawed his streaming hair out of his eyes. A wave lifted him, and he looked anxiously about. He was floating naked in a strong swell, the shore no more than a sun-reddened streak of gray in the distance, and he could see no other shape among the wave crests. Then came a splash, and Kara's light laughter rippled like harp strings among the soft rush and thunder of the ocean. Two warm and wholly human arms slithered around his neck, and her slender body was a startling warmth in the dawn-chilled waters. "Kara, you—" Then he had to hold her close and kiss her, taste the salt on her soft neck. Her dark eyes sparkled into his, and he sought to see past the gentle mockery he read there, and heard in her voice. "But you were not worried, surely? For me? Who in all the world has less to fear from any element than I?" He held her to him, tight, as if at any moment she might slip away into the depths beneath. "I was afraid you might have changed again, gone where I could not follow." She stroked his forehead. "Why would I do that, my heart, even if I could? Have you not bested me before, you and your cunning helm?" "Aye, but it strains me, Kara. I was not born to this constant shifting and change, and I love you as you are. I would have you so." She lowered her eyes and smiled a small smile. "And did you not just? In what counts, at any rate." Elof laughed, though it rang hollow in the emptiness within, and bent his head to hers. "That I'll grant you. Though the rest was strange enough. In all conscience, it was good. But I'm wearied now, and the ocean's ice chill yet at this hour. Let's be swimming back for breakfast, huh?" She threw up her arms above her head, as if about to dive. Her serpentine gold arm ring flashed warmly in the sunlight. "Gladly. In what? As ourselves, Kara. Please." She pulled free of his arms, rolled idly on her back in the water, and let a wave crest bear her along. "If we must." Then suddenly her long legs thrashed, sprayed water in his face, and she was torpedoing off through the waves, almost as fast, it seemed, as in any unhuman form. Elof groaned and launched himself after her. He was a powerful swimmer, but a graceless one, and in another moment she was rolling and plunging about him like the dolphin she could be, tickling him, nipping him, tangling his thrashing legs, or simply brushing herself against him and darting out of reach. And that he found most disturbing of all. She was seldom so skittish, and unease swelled in him. "All right," he protested, coming to a halt and treading water. "Have it as you will. Match me now." He reached up and pulled the helm over his head once more and ducked down. Side by side, twisting in the first shaft of sunlight, two seals arrowed towards the coast. But it was in human form that the two clambered onto the warm stones of the sea-wall and stood dripping a moment. "Well," laughed Kara, leaning on Elof's shoulder and clutching her swan cloak about her, "may I shape-shift once more, or would you have us stride through the streets as we are? We've scandalized the night watch enough already, I doubt not. Shift, and I'll follow." Kara, already in swan's shape once more, chose to hear that as a challenge. Rather than flying straight home, she led him on a lively dance around and about the forests of masts, diving and weaving among the tangles of rigging with a leisurely grace that was wholly deceptive. Plunging after her between trailing clumps of blocks and tackle that every moment threatened to snare a wing and send him spinning down to the deck or sea, Elof felt the terrible sinking of doubt grow ever greater in him. Soon, very soon now, this great fleet must take to the sea, sailing southward as they had every spring these 7 years past, on a great voyage south and east, making landfall upon the barren coasts of the inland seas. From there, the king and his crews would retrace the way overland through the borderlands of the hostile wastes to the fair coasts of the west, the road by which, 1,000 years past, Vade had led the last comers from Morven to the land of Bryhane in the west. There they would help to hold off the advancing Equesh marauders for another summer, and at its end, as the raiders retreated for the winter, bear back with them still more of Kerberheim's unhappy people. And with the fleet, as in every one of those 7 springs, Elof and Kara would go. Long and arduous that way would be, yet it was none of the many perils of the wild that awoke such unease in Elof's heart. To the menaces of the forest realm, Tapaula on Aethan, they were as nothing. And though he had already passed and bested the will of its shadowy lord, it is the perils we bear with us that I fear. By the time he landed upon the high balcony of the palace, Kara was already shaking the sea-water from her swan cloak, whirling it this way and that in a rain of droplets. "There! And what, pray you, was so terrible about that?" "Nothing," said Elof somberly, "as well you know. And yet—" Kara's dark eyes seemed to narrow further. "And yet?" she echoed, and her arms fell to her sides. "It happens ever more of late. You grow restless. The fit falls on you of a sudden, and you are gone. By strange ways, in strange forms. You are often hard to follow." "Not by design. Are you not as apt as I am at the sport? You proved that long ago." "Perhaps, though it is natural to you. Other shapes are but masks to me. They soon gall. But is it any longer a sport, Kara?" She stared at him, bewildered. Why? Why indeed, Kara? What is it stirs in you, calls you so? The spring, perhaps. Nothing more? No other behest, no other voice, nothing that would summon you away from me? No. From you? Her arms went out to him, and hearing the hurt in her voice, he could only take them, hold her to him. What could ever be strong enough to do that? He shook his head. Then what is it, Kara, my love? For there is something. I would swear it. In the palace towers above, bells chimed, sounding the first hour of the day, and she pulled away from him, laughing again. What a mood for so fine a morning! Come, dress if you are so set on your breakfast. Other bells were echoing the hour from the city below, an instant apart, so that the peals rang together, but not as one. Elof, struggling into tunic and hose, watched Kara flow into her gown with liquid grace. Even so it is with us, he thought. But as he followed her out onto one of the open galleries that circled the palace like a coronet, he said no more, only listened intently to the music of the bells. Many who knew intimately could distinguish their individual tones clear among the clangor. Good chimes, well-pitched, ringing brightly without crack or flaw. Those bells he had cast himself, making good the destructions of the Ekwesh occupation. He knew every stage of their making, from the alloying to the final raising. He could trust them. Then he grew wroth with himself for what that thought implied, whether about Kara or others. His trust was not so narrow as that. He had friends enough who had risked their lives with him, for him, and for whom he had done the same, or would gladly. Those bonds were of nothing so fragile as metal, nor so easily forged. Then why think worse of Kara? A gleam of gold caught his eye, and for all the warmth of the sunlight he went cold. He had shaped her that arm ring. That was why. The ring and all that went with it. Without those virtues, those patterned forces in the gold. Once, a lonely, desperate youth, he had pressed it on her. She had taken it, in sympathy perhaps, and suppose she had not. What would he be to her then? He bit his lips savagely. But then she turned and laughed, warmer than gold or sunlight, and tucked her strong, slim arm in his, pressing closer to his side, and he could resist her no more. He hugged her close, and they made their way thus down the long stairs to the lower galleries. The cold core of doubt and fear within him seemed to melt and dwindle, yet, tempered and hardened by fear of loss, some tiny sliver still remained. Under the new kingship and the restored peace, the great halls of the palace of Morvenhall, through which they walked, were flourishing as they never had before the Ekwesh came. There was not one of that fierce folk now left alive east of the mountains, so far as any could tell. In a swift and bloody week, the land had been scoured of them and of those others, shadowy followers of the ice worshipper Brihon, who had guided and prepared their invasion. Freed from the Ekwesh, the Eastlands had begun to grow and flourish once again. From the day he took possession of his halls, the new king had made his first priority the feeding of his folk, organizing the fair sharing of what supplies there were, and the urgent clearing and planting of land that had been left fallow and overgrown for many years. But even as the first planting was ending, he was setting out with what ships and men the land could afford for the Westlands, and for Kerberheim, the city that 2 years since had all but driven him out. He found it in a very different mood, harried by famine and disease, the power of the syndicacy in tatters. It might have been in total anarchy, save that the threat of the Eqwesh had grown so great there that internal differences had come to seem light by comparison, and perhaps also the death of Brihon had led to a lessening of the strife. Ironically enough, it was the Norderney fugitives the syndics had once sought to bar who had become the staunchest supporters of order and the fiercest fighters against the invading Reavers. But they were not enough. Slowly but surely, the lands of the great landowners were being overrun, and their peasants were fleeing within the walls of the city, reducing the flow of its food supply even as they increased the demands on it. The prospect of an eastern realm which neither Eqwesh nor ice could easily reach, with a diminished population and land to spare, became suddenly appealing even to those landowners, and to those partisans of the Briheren faction who had long opposed the line of Morven. When under Kermorven's generalship a mingled force of men of Norderney, Kerberheim, and Morvenhall decimated or drove out all the larger bands of marauders, all opposition fell strangely silent, and many who had most fiercely opposed the kingship became most vocal in seeking its shelter. More sought to go with Kermorven than he could possibly take. He promised a return for them, and this promise he had kept. That first fleet sailed back in time to help with a harvest of unlooked-for abundance, and from that day forth it became only a matter of time until the West was abandoned. That time drew nearer with every passing year. During those years, the palace saw many rich and splendid feasts, commanded by the king as token of its reborn prosperity, or to welcome unhappy refugees from the Westlands. But at the first meal of the day there was no pomp or luxury. Lord and servant ate together if they chose. The fare was simple, the mood quiet and relaxed in preparation for the labors of the day ahead. In this it reflected the nature of the king himself. As often at this hour, he had forsaken his high table and ate at his ease out on the gallery, contemplating the harbor and the muster of his fleet. His lean frame was wrapped in a light robe. His bronzen hair was unkempt. He wore plain, rope-soled seaman's sandals and seemed wholly at peace with himself and the world. When he saw Elof and Kara approaching, he rose at once, smiling, and greeted them with his usual slightly stiff good nature. "My master, my lady, come and grace my table. I'm glad to see you so early, Elof. Much must be settled today ere the shipyards can begin their labors, and with ills away, our wisest smith should advise me." Kara laughed. "Then you will excuse me, will you not, my Lord Karen? And you, Elof? You know such matters have little hold upon my mind. I'll breakfast with our friends within." She kissed Elof lightly and glided down the steps into the cool depths of the halls. The men watched her go. Elof, a little ruefully. Kermorven smiled. "She adorns our halls. It is good to see that you and she have still your share of the happiness we have found." Elof slumped down into a chair so hard that its light frame protested. "Do we?" Kermorven sat down more slowly, and his misty blue gaze grew suddenly piercing. "A tale reached me but moments since," he remarked with dry disapproval. "A wild tale, such as the watcher wont to dream up at a dull night's ending." Elof groaned faintly. Then the king's stern features were suddenly illuminated by a mischievous twinkle. I can only say that you both looked remarkably fresh. And well, I'm no authority. I think it is hardly so that love lessons. Elof felt his scowl harden. Our love? No. But he hesitated, but his need to speak, to mold words out of his inner blackness, was too great. It is our trust I fear for, and Kara's safety. Kermorven, she was seeking to escape me. I'm sure of it. Kermorven sat up, startled. Escape you? Talk sense, man. I mean it. She changed, flew. I woke and followed. But if I had not woken, what then? What then? How far would she have flown? And where? To whom? Kermorven, there is another voice calls her. Of that I am sure. Another voice. Kermorven's face darkened once again, and his voice took on an edge that belied its quietness. She who mastered her of old, you mean? Yes, that would not surprise me. Inevitable that Lohi would try to summon her back. The Lady of the Ice is hardly one to forgive or forget. Were the thing snatched from her less precious, or less loved? Elof heard himself blurt out, and the bitterness lay like metal on his tongue. Kermorven inclined his head sympathetically, yet a little distantly, as if to set himself apart from Elof's jealousy. What of that? It is past. Whom Kara loves, that is what matters. That is what must counter the call. That, strengthened by your love, your trust. Elof flushed. That alone was never enough to win her free of Lohi. Not even though she had my arm ring, with all the virtues I set upon it. Not while you were apart, but from the moment she saw you once more, she began to struggle. You called upon that ring, and she triumphed. I, for a moment, then I had to hunt her down. It was the moment that mattered, said Kermorven sharply. That set you free, to free her. Do you remember? I was there. I saw. He stroked his chin thoughtfully. And that was when you hardly knew one another, when she could scarcely believe your love was possible. Now you have had years together, happy years. The links will be stronger. But strong enough? Blazed Elof. Dare I trust her? For her own sake? If they are not strong enough, then seeking to tighten her bonds may only weaken them further. Kermorven smiled thinly. Even I can see that, little versed as I am in matters of the heart. If you doubt her strength, lend her your own. Do not force it upon her. Have patience. Wait. There lies the best counsel I can give you. That, don't forget your food. He gestured to the table at his side, which held dishes of smoked meat, cornbread, curds, and fruit. Now, about the Alavin's refit. The shipwrights report that the old tackle will not bear the new rig. We cannot rely on Ills returning in time, and other than she, only you truly understand ship work. For the next hour, Kermorven kept Elof so busy discussing shipyard problems that he should have had no time to think of anything else. And perhaps that was in part his purpose. But instead, Elof found himself answering and eating in a kind of abstracted daze, while the core of his mind wandered along other paths. He heard his own voice as if it was another's, though it spoke sense enough, while while through his inner self fears and worries stalked. He found himself longing for Kara to return, constantly fighting down the urge to run and find her, to be sure she had not somehow vanished away once more. When he heard her laughter, soft and bright as fine gold, echo unmistakably out of the shadows of the hall, he felt his whole being relax in reassurance. Yet only minutes later, he was anxious again. Wait, he told himself sarcastically. Have patience. That was not the turn of a smith's mind. They could be patient only in action, not inaction. No more was it their way to leave weak links lying. They would sooner forge the whole chain anew. All throughout that day, it was that vision that haunted his thoughts, of a chain stretched to breaking. How he got through the many tasks that devolved upon the court smith and chiefest counselor of so active a king, he never knew. For Kara was ever in his mind. Kara, whom he loved too well to risk losing once again. Yet somehow it was evening, and he came to the door of their chambers in the palace, those high rooms where Kara's chains had been broken, and they had first become lovers. A great weariness was upon him, and a need for comfort, and the sight of Kara, reclining upon a daybed on the balcony, was balm to his tormented heart. She sat there in silent silhouette, contemplating a sunset of eggshell greens and blues beneath a canopy of clouds streaked fiercely red and gold. And when he approached her, she did not turn, but waved him to the couch beside her. He stooped to kiss her, then stopped as he saw tracks of fire upon her cheeks, as though the angry clouds wept, and not she. She looked up sharply into his face and began to speak, then hesitated. You asked me earlier if there was any other voice that called me, that sought to part me from you, and I denied it. But, heart, you were right. For a moment he felt a vast sinking away beneath him, and then a sudden recovery. At least she was admitting it. He would help her now. Yes, it's that she-wolf Louhi, isn't it? Kara gave a short, bitter laugh and gestured dismissively. Her? Oh, yes, she is always there, far off, whispering, tugging. But I had almost ceased to think of her. This is something more, a thing hard to understand, something I cannot know for certain. Yet with every fiber of my being, I sense it. A great change coming, a balance swaying this way and that, and whichever way it tips must alter the world. She turned and leaned on the low railing of the balcony, gazing out at the sea. The wind had turned westerly now, by the gilded vanes on the high roofs below, and it was driving gray breakers in against seawall and shore, booming upon block and gravel. Above them flocked gulls, bright in the last of the light, and their harsh cries awoke new fear in his heart, that at any moment she might fly up from him and be lost in their numberless throngs. A wave rises over all things. Oh, a wave rises over all things, and soon it will break. Much that is new must flow in. Much that is old must be swept away. And I am old, heart, very old. Elof caressed her crisp, dark curls, stroked her smooth cheek. You are no older than when first I set eyes upon you, and you have little memory of the years, you have said. Little, till first I came into bondage, till first I set eyes upon you. Elof frowned. Are the two then so close? Only in time. You do not bind me. I am not your property, your instrument and plaything, as I was hers. Once I roamed the world uncaring, unremembering, save when I served the steerers in war, and that too was in my nature from the first. So to be held again, save by my own will, by myself, even to think of that sickens me. But with you, I am happy. As before? As when you were free? She gazed around at him, her green eyes wide with astonishment. But surely, why else should I stay? Elof nodded. Why, indeed? But this change you sense, it comes soon, you feel? The sun rolled beneath the horizon, and all things beyond the balcony, tree, rooftop, cliff, darkened to shapes of shadow against the sky, golden now as peach skin, shot with gray clouds. She smiled. Soon need not be as men conceive it. Then she looked away again. And a day may come when I would welcome it, embrace it. Having known you, I cannot ever be the same. Elof knew what she meant. In all the years he had loved her, she had not aged, nor would she, perhaps, within the circles of the world. Whereas he would share the common lot of men. But he had accepted that, for himself, with an ease that surprised him. Was it selfishness that he so seldom thought what it would mean to her? But suppose it did come soon, he persisted. Soon as I would see it, I mean. Would you resist it, then, and stay with me? Could you? I don't know, she breathed. How can I know? Were the choice mine, yes, my heart, I would try, I would strive, with all my being I would. But Elof leaned over, gripped her bare arms, gazed deep into her eyes that had the shade of a forest pool, the alert gaze of deer that drank there. Do you fear you cannot resist, heart? That you lack the fortitude? The strength? Let me help you. Join my strength to yours. How may I do that? How can you help? I will study. I will seek. It would not be the first time I managed what a power could not. I need time, Kara. Time. You must trust me. Give me that time. Hold yourself as safe meanwhile as you know how. She flashed him a sudden, uncertain glance. What do you mean? I mean, rein in your urge to change. It is that betrays you. Hold your human form. Cease to shift and wander through the world, save at great need. For now, only for now. She turned her head away indignantly, and he heard her voice go very cold. I trust you when you say you love me and do not want to part. I need no proof. But in trusting me this, for now, only for now, you will be showing me how strong that love, that wish could be. Her teeth gleamed white, biting hard against her lower lip. I would promise, gladly I would, she cried out, desperate. But dare I? Can I? Have I the strength? You cannot imagine how strong is the urge. I can, he said softly. if only by the pain it causes you. But you have the power to see that you never break your promise by one simple act. Give me your swan cloak that you need to take on new forms. Give it me, and I shall lock it in my strongest chest, returning it to you only at need. Believe me, he added, to forestall her cry of protest. I guess how great a trust that would be. But for now, at least, we have no better answer, and no way to find one. Take time to think, if you wish. But at once she rose, and from the seat beside her she plucked the cloak, swirling it around her shoulders. But instead she folded it carefully, neatly, and held it tight to her breast a moment, burying her face in the down. Then impetuously she thrust it into Elof's hands. It hung there lightly, like a sliver of cloud. He lowered his eyes and turned away into the inner chambers, where stood several chests, some metal-bound, some wholly of metal. It was to a large one he turned, and with a small key and some murmured words, he unlocked the lid and laid the cloak reverently upon the piles of cloth-wrapped volumes within, shifting some of the bright jewels aside so that there was no chance of any snagging. He closed the lid again with more words upon it, and went back to the balcony. There stood Kara still, gazing out into emptiness, her shoulders bowed and her arms crossed, hugging her breast, as against a chill. He laid his hands upon her shoulders, very gently, meaning to slide his arms down to embrace her. But she whirled around, gazing into his face with eyes large and liquid. "Hold me," she whispered. "Hold me, for the world grows dark. Let us live. Let us seize love and joy while we can." He felt her arms suddenly cold under his fingers, and he held her tight, let his mantle fall around her, covering her from the onrushing night. "I will hold you," he whispered. "But even now I can do more, Kara, if you will let me. I can shield you." "No! You would forge your love into a cage." He knew well what was in her thoughts, how she had wept with rage at her first sight of caged songbirds in the city markets. Before the day's end, Kermorven, not easily swayed on any matter, had found himself forbidding the practice altogether. She shook her head insistently. "You would temper bars for me to flutter against, till at last I grew weary, ceased to care, and shattered them altogether. We must find some other way. I would not be pinioned ever again, love, by any force save one, and that is myself." He looked into her intent eyes on a level with his own, and ran his hand through her dark hair. And even as he did so, a cold thought came into his mind, and there took root. "So be it," he said quietly, and bent to kiss her on the brow. All right, we made it to the end of chapter 1. So I'm going to take a quick break to stretch my legs. Then we'll do chapter 2, and then we'll call it for the night after that one. And hey, Sub-Average Joe, how are you tonight? Good to see you. I don't say anything when I'm reading, but I try to type in there when I can, just so you guys know I am paying attention to you. Y'all are here for me. I'm here for you. All right, guys, I will be back momentarily. I'm going to go kick on the AC again for a moment, try to get it cooled back down in here just a little bit. I will be back very shortly, Sub-Average Joe. I tried to take a quick break between chapters just to rest my voice, get something to drink really quick, walk for a moment, and then I'll be right back momentarily. All right, I'm fairly certain that my running that AC for about 2 minutes there did absolutely nothing. Because the AC, of course, is in my bedroom, which my office is off my bedroom. But, oh well. One more chapter tonight, and then we'll be okay. So, as we have seen, Elof has bad thoughts in his head. Bad thoughts. And he's thinking, how can I cage Kara? Not a good idea, dude. Not a good idea. But he is probably going to try to do it anyway. So, sit back, relax, and let's read the next chapter. Chapter 2. The Flaw. There remained only a few weeks till the fleet must sail, and in that time Elof had more than enough in hand to occupy every waking hour. Though the Eastlands had not, as Bryhane, lost the true smithcraft, the art had fallen into decline. Few smiths of any great ability had escaped there from Morven, and though many books of lore survived, fewer still were born able to make proper use of them. Certainly, there were none in these lands now to compare with the master smiths of Norderney. Of these, many had perished in the sack of that land, or in the hardships of the flight south, and with them great reserves of skill and learning had been lost. Only a handful had survived to come east, and some of those too old to do more than teach and oversee. It fell upon Elof to apportion the labors of the rest, and of such likely journeymen as he could find. What remained, he most often had to do with his own hand, and always when the utmost craft was called for. For whatever their degree of mastery, the mage smiths of either land were loath now to measure themselves against Elof Valantor, still young though he might be, and the craft they saw ablaze behind his strange-hued eyes. Yet the idea he had would not quit him, but grew and took shape even when he seemed to have forgotten it, like a serpent uncoiling in darkness. He lived in peace with Kara, and she never asked her cloak of him, but busied herself as much as he with preparations for the voyage. But the thought would come to his mind at odd moments, as he proved chain and tackle on the launching slips, or fashioned strong fastenings for sheet and hawser, and each time it would be that fraction clearer, that step more advanced. When he dwelt upon it too long, and upon its implications, it began subtly to disturb him. Then he at once forgot it again, because he had to. Right or wrong, it hardly mattered when he could not spare a tenth of the time he would need to make that thought real. Indeed, it might never have come to fruition if help had not arrived from an unexpected quarter. One chilly dawn, the clear note of a horn drifted up to the watch on the city's main gate. Elof, already making his way down the steep main street to the shipyards, saw them hasten to the windlasses and stayed to watch. The huge doors ground back in their sockets to reveal an extraordinary caravan. A cluster of hooded figures, short and square, who were leading a train of baggage beasts that looked like vast, shaggy hill goats. But Elof knew them for musk oxen from the mountains, and that only one folk could be leading them thus. He went racing down the slippery cobbles with his tool pack bouncing and jingling at his side. The caravan's leader looked up, hailed cheerfully, and came running to meet him also. Man and Duerg collided with a solid smack in the center of the road, and clung to each other as they threatened to fall over. A hood spilled off thick, dark curls, bright eyes, a flashing, breathless grin. With irresistible strength, two firm arms drew Elof's face down for a kiss as solid and smacking as their first encounter. and he hugged the girl tight, intensely aware of how different she felt from Kara, the hard, buxom breadth of her. Ilse, still breathless, pulled back a little too sharply, but then laughed as if to lighten her reaction. "Well then, young human, do I find you well?" She prodded him amiably in the midriff and frowned. "On the thin side, even for a man." He smiled. "I've been busy this last week or two. More Smith's work than we bargained for." "And is she seeing to it that you don't forget to eat? Well, I thought you might be running into a little trouble, so I've brought back some help." She gestured at her companions, busily goading the half-tamed and rebellious musk oxen into these unfamiliar surroundings. "Smiths, all of them. Not the finest we have in the East by a long chalk, just middling. But I wanted them day-hardy, so they must needs be young. And with them a fine stock of finer ores, such as we've so far found in the old delvings." "Ilse," said Elof reverently, "you're a marvel. Even middling Duergar smiths can strike sparks off our best men. And we've been too harried to go and hunt down new metals." He paused a moment, feeling the cold thought blossom in him once more. "You wouldn't have any silver ore among your panniers, would you?" "Silver?" snorted Ilse. "Silver overflowing. Take it and welcome. We dwell among silver. We tangle nuggets in our river nets. We strike new seams with every old air shaft we open. Comes in handy for making new light mirrors. And we need 'em. Huge they are, these old workings, and twisty as a greased worm. Even our eyes need all the sun we can carry down." "Even when you can capture sun and fire in your crystal lamps?" She grimaced. "Could we but craft them like that one in your gauntlet, we'd have less swink, aye. But we've not matched it. Not yet," she added hastily. Elof kept his face rigid. For all her friendship with men, Ilse ran true to her race. "Maybe when some more of our folk come east." He was careful to avoid offering his own help. "You think they will?" "There have been few enough till now." "We're a slower folk to change, Elof. Not like you Mayfly men. They'll be watching and waiting to see how the first few have fared ere they took up roots that go back many 1,000 years. Even Ansker's of that mind. We've never before lived so openly around men. But now we've reopened the ancient mountain halls, and have some rich workings of our own to tempt them, away from human gaze. Aye, more'll come, and if they can't manage—" She regarded him levelly and took a deep breath. "Why then, Elof Valantor, you might teach us much." He blinked in astonishment, and with a wicked glitter in her eyes, she added, "Never thought to hear that, did you? But I only said might, mind. Well, the sun's all but up. I'll have the silver sent over to the Hall of Guild in the noontide, and my lads when they've rested. Right now, I want some breakfast. So we'll go pay our respects at the palace, though it's plain enough eating there, in all conscience." A note of amused affection crept into her voice. "How fares the long lad, by the by?" Elof smiled. "Still king, driving himself harder than any servant, and looking well on it. But all the better for seeing you, I've no doubt. Rock's down south in Pendyra port on business for him, but he's due back within the week." "And your lady?" "She's well as ever, thank you." Elof was sure he had spoken naturally. He had taken pains to. But he was suddenly uncomfortably aware of Ilse's piercing dark gaze. But all she said, equally naturally, was, "So? I'm glad to hear it. That we've traveled these hard hills before won't make them the less perilous. We'll be happier having her with us." She hesitated a moment then, before adding, "Take good care of her, Elof. She is a rare creature." He nodded, knowing that her concern was not for Kara. "I intend to, Ilse. Believe me, I do." Thus it was the coming of the Duergar smiths that left him free to put his purpose into effect. And how matters might have gone otherwise, none can say. That afternoon, when he had sent them about the many tasks he had in hand, he found himself suddenly with a little time to spare. Quitting the great forge that was his in the vaults of the ancient halls of the Smiths' Guild, he strolled along wide corridors that rang and chimed with the strokes of heavy hammers, roared with the breath of bellows and furnace. The weighty hangings that were mounted over the walls of smooth stone to deaden these echoes had long since darkened to a sooty black. He mounted the wide stairs into cleaner air and quieter, past the newly refurbished libraries and scholars' rooms to the upper floors, in whose smaller chambers the master jewelers and fine artificers kept their workshops. Here the din echoing along the walls was shriller, swifter, a tingling and chiming of light hammers and fine instruments against rare metals and gems. Here it was the acrid stench of solders, corrosives, and cleaning pickles that tainted the air, the hangings stained and faded, and in places charred or withered through. At a high window, a bent old master-smith, surrounded by a gaggle of black-garbed apprentices, was demonstrating a delicate instrument, explaining the virtues of orientation and steadiness worked into its metals. Elof nodded to them as he passed, thinking he knew the device, an aid to navigation made to determine very precisely the elevation of sun, moon, and stars. He wished devoutly that some instrument might measure as minutely the courses of their steerers. He paused before a tall door of hardened oak, marked with a name in fine laced silver, knocked lightly, and entered at the muffled summons. A lean woman of about his years looked up from the gilded chalice she was burnishing. Her large eyes widened further. "Good day, master." She rose awkwardly from her bench, but he motioned her back with a smile. "And to you also, master. Don't let me disturb it." She smiled hesitantly, brushing brown locks back from her forehead. A nervous gesture, it seemed. He knew from Rock that Marja was always nervous in his presence, yet she looked at him with the eyes of a fellow smith. "My errand should devour little of your precious time, a minor matter upon which I would know the mind of a master jeweler, one whose craft is turned so closely to adorning the body. Why, think you, of all the noble metals, or which, think you, of all the noble metals, has the greatest affinity with the body, with human flesh and blood?" Marja subsided slowly onto her bench, her face already slackening with the distraction of thought. "Why, gold, I suppose many would say. That is the tradition, anyhow. For the softness of it, they say, and the seeming warmth." Elof sat down in front of her. "And you?" he prompted. I am not of that mind, not wholly. Less so since I read some scholars of the old Eastlands here. For the greatest affinity, might you not need to look beyond metals altogether? To some of those odd stuffs the ancient master-smiths made, akin to metal in their properties, but more malleable. She knitted her fingers with enthusiasm. There was a tale old Joran told me once of the stuff that was spun from the very stuff of life itself. Living matter reduced to its ultimate pure ash, and was stronger than any metal, lighter too. It was one of the heroic maidesmiths of Morven made it, I remember. Or of Karis even. Arv, or Aluki Threefinger, or Vade. Somebody like that. Elof grinned. I know. Mylio told me of that too. Make good tales to fire apprentices with, don't they? Sets them dreaming of discovering such wonders for themselves. But the secret of that strong stuff is lost, if it ever existed, and none of the others we know of will serve. No, it has to be metal. She had grown nervous again. Well, then, it is a subtle point on which few can be certain, but whatever tradition says, I would choose silver. Elof nodded with slow satisfaction. I thought you might, in your hard-won wisdom. Tradition once had it that women did not make good smiths also. She flushed at the compliment. It's that the warmth of gold is an illusion. It can be a barrier to heat in many instances. And as for being soft, well, flesh is soft, but it holds its shape, and there's bone beneath. And the bone setters? They come to a smith's, do they not, for alloys of silver, plates and pins of it to join and patch shattered or splintered bones. The bone may well grow out around them with little hurt. The flesh and skin heal over them. A hardened silver will endure the fluids of the body better than any metal, save some special steels. And those hard to make and harder to fashion, save perhaps for the Duergar, she added ruefully, or yourself. Elof grinned and shook his head. For armory, perhaps, not for fine tasks. Silver is subtler, as you say, readier to take fine shape upon itself, and deep craft. But of course, to maintain the affinity, it need not be set within the body. Marja smiled. Hardly. Though I have found serviceable a setting in some way symbolic of the union. A zoning, say, an encirclement, a girdle, a necklace, an arm ring. She hesitated. Evidently she had heard something of that, from Rock or from Kara herself. But Elof only chuckled, putting her at ease again. That indeed! Though I was but apprentice when I crafted Kara's, and used gold at my master's behest, there was one who lacked the woman's insight. But for yours, I thank you, and leave you to your tasks. I was half of your mind on a difficult point, and now you've settled it well. A word of Rock? Well, he should not be long now. Again, a good day to you, master. She looked at him a little curiously as he took his leave, but made no move to ask him why he had asked what he had. It was common for master smiths to be secretive about their work, especially in its earliest stages, and to pry would be a grave breach of manners as the guild understood them. That would not stop her thinking, but she, only recently made master, would hardly be likely to guess at his true purpose. He himself had been slow enough to conceive it. Even now he balked at it, half yearned to let that thought remain a thought. But then consuming fear came upon him all the more strongly, and a great horror at the thought of abandoning Kara to the cold mind, dark heart that had first ensnared her. Should he let that happen when he might so easily prevent it? How could he live with himself if he did? The prentices, still taking sights with their instruments, turned to greet him as he passed, but fell silent. He saw his look mirrored in their dismay, and turned it to a rueful smile. Back once more in his forge, he sat gazing at the panniers of ore left him by Ilse's fellows, picking out chunks and turning them over in his fingers. Silver was among those metals that could be seen clearly even in its natural state. His knowing fingers traced the threads and streaks with which the living rock was shot, as if they were its veins and nerves. And was not that another affinity with the living? It remained for him now to render it, concentrate it, distill the essence of this stony flesh, and set within it. Once more his mind shied at the thought, and once more that iron purpose, forged by fear, tempered by desperation, goaded it to its crucial leap. He roused himself, went to the door to call in apprentices from the training forge nearby, then stopped. The fewer hands that mingled in this work, the better, for many reasons. With all his strength, he heaved the first pannier from the ground and began to tip the ore into the crushing trough. When all was done, he spun a heavy bar pivoted in the stone wall, and water came gushing from a metal chute above, swirling the loose dirt from the chunks and herding them slowly down the trough towards the iron block at the end. As the flow quickened, he lowered into it a tall, flanged wheel set in a framework among levers, and two heavy shafts tipped at their end with iron blocks as big as his head, shaped to bite against the iron below. The levers worked as the wheel spun, lifting and letting fall the shafts, catching and crushing the ore between iron and iron. The shattered pieces ground to finer fragments as they passed beneath the center of the wheel, a hub of hard stone. Retreating from the noise, Elof smiled in satisfaction. He had adapted this engine from those in the forge of the master-smith Mylio, and if it was smaller, driven by Morvenhall's ducted water supply, and not a mountain torrent, it was also subtler and less cumbersome. One day, perhaps, if he needed more power, he might harness the pounding of the waves below, or, as some smiths had of old, the contained and perilous force of heated steam. But not even that could match the blast of the earth fires by which the master-smith's furnaces were fed, and which, at times, he missed most sorely in his work. The Duergar might have helped him harness them, but there were simply no such fires near enough the surface in this rolling seacoast region. Smith lore had taught him that nature held many other sources of great heat, from the sun's gathered light to the inner turbulence of certain metals subtly purified, but also how hard they were to tap, how perilous. For one brief minute of wonder and terror, he had trapped the lightning in his fist, and seen how small man stood against the compass of such forces. To draw upon the least of them would require long study, and though he had bent some time to his researches, always some matter of greater urgency had intervened, and always there was Kara. He had ideas, but as yet he was far from any answer. He rose and busied himself about his furnace. Water drove the bellows. Behind the panel of sooty mica in the door, their glow changed from red to glaring yellow in the blast, and thence to a core of dazzling white about the foot of the crucible he had thrust in. The coals sizzled and sang, and as he watched the little pyramid of crushed ore slump and trickle inward, he caught the note of the singing, rising and falling, and found within it, as visions are seen in hearth fires, the music of songs. One, ringing and compulsive, he knew well, though from where he could not say. The other was something new, quite new, a slower, lilting, flowing phrase that seemed to lead him on to others. That was good, that the song sung over this work should arise out of it, one upon another, phrases that grew and burgeoned like twinning flowers. Should flowers also be the starting point of the pattern he must set upon his work? But there might be something better, something closer. He ran his fingers idly over the blocks of fine beeswax he had set out, humming vague snatches of tunes, seeking for the shape they suggested within the amber depths of the wax. For a moment, forgetting the array of knives and carving tools beside it, he plucked up a long, thin block and, warming it at the furnace wall, began to work it between his fingers. It flowed and responded under his powerful grasp. "Even so," he muttered, "even this, you learn well what you must do. Your proper pattern you shall have." And that night, as the stars wheeled beyond their balcony and Kara tensed and flowed beneath him amid the tangle of their sheets, he ran his hands through her crisp hair, forcing her head back to kiss her fluttering throat. He had meant to grip lightly, but in the force of his passion, his hands clenched tight, and when they fell away, trembling, they grasped a whole wisp of her hairs, not the single one he had need of. But this they could smile at, for he in turn bore the impress of her nails upon his back, sharp as talons. Later, when she slept, he padded over to the chest where her cloak was bestowed, unlocked it, and very softly raised the lid. There lay the cloak, gleaming so white in the faint light that when he lifted one corner, the blackness of the lining seemed absolute, and he had to riffle the little feathers with his fingers to find their roots. At last he chose one, inconspicuous, yet near the garment's edge, caught it between finger and thumb, and plucked it loose. There was a sudden, slight gasp, and to his horror, he heard Kara whimper in her sleep, looked up and saw her, curled up on her side, straighten out suddenly and reach up to rub at one shoulder. He felt moisture on his fingers, a slight warm stickiness he could not mistake, and froze unmoving where he knelt. But her eyes did not open. Her arm fell away onto her breast, and she slipped back once more into sleep. When he dared move again, he reached down, caught the cloak between his fingers. Beneath the feathers he felt some fine silken fabric against the outer cloak. No more. He folded it back carefully into the chest, smoothing it with what was almost a caress, and quietly locked the lid once more. He rose shakily to his feet, sick with self-disgust, half-minded to hurl away the feather and the hairs he clutched, sticky with a spot of drying blood. But instead, he forced himself to tuck them into the fold of cotton he had laid ready, and returned it to the aumbry. Then, clambering back into bed, he reached out almost desperately to Kara. Sleepily she came to him and clung, and he buried his face in the warmth of her shoulder. Had she awoken then, he might still have blurted out what was on his mind. But sleep held her fast as any human. So it overtook Elof also, and so the first light woke them, to love again, half sleeping, and in loving, forget. By the coming of the day, Elof's doubts had receded like a troubled dream, and it was easy to blame the blood on one of his own smarting scratches. The next day, in between his official duties, he set about further extracting the pure silver from the reduced ore by amalgamating it with quicksilver, a subtle but hazardous process. Only after there was no further chance of fumes could he bolt the doors of his forge and lay out his prizes upon a scrubbed, clean workbench, guarding against the least draught that might snatch them away. For a while he toyed with them, setting the lock of hair and the feather together in various ways till he had an arrangement that pleased him. He chalked a quick sketch of it upon a slate, multiplied it to form a frieze, then drew the frieze in various perspectives, in circles, rings, spirals. And it was as he completed the spiral design that he found himself humming again, those first faint serpentine phrases of the new song, ever more clearly. A spiral. He took up the shape he had already made. A flowing spiral of feathers interwoven with locks of hair, winding forever onward, but winding about a torus, and so coming forever back upon itself, free, yet unchanging, forever fleeing, yet forever returning. He nodded to himself. It would take great care, but it could be done. He scrubbed his crude sketch from the slate, took up ink and parchment pieces, and set to work constructing a large and intricate version of the design. It took him many hours and several false starts, and all the while singing softly to himself. The floor around him was littered with discarded sheets, and when he had at last finished, he was careful to gather these and thrust them into the forge. The parchments curled and whined and sizzled like living things upon the hot coals, but he scarcely noticed. His hands were already upon the wax, probing its smooth contours with a burin finer than the finest of the hairs it would portray. By now it was late at night, but for all his distrust of wearied mind and hands, he labored on, driven as he had not been since his youth, singing still under his breath, hardly aware of it. It was not easy work, for the glabrous wax was not parchment to be inscribed, nor wood to be chiseled clean. Any mark caused its surface to swell and change. It might flake away where it was too brittle, or ooze where it was soft. Every stroke had to be incised with care and foresight, its shavings minutely cleaned away before the next. Flat lines had to be translated into incised channels or raised ridges, and the tapering of the hairs, the fine fluff at the feathers' bases, represented. Even the dark stain on the quill he sought to match by subtle texture. It was master's work, and in the mere precision of its detail it was fair. As if already there is something of her in it, he thought, and was pleased. Yet that pleasure only sharpened the spurs of fear. On and on he labored, till he found the delicate tools slipping between fingers sweating or numbed. Many times he managed to avoid damaging the work only at the cost of cuts and punctures, and it was his own blood made them slippery then. When at last some shred of sane caution told him to lay down the thing he held, to get it free of his trembling fingers before he ruined it, he felt almost sick with frustration. Only little by little did reason reassert itself as he hobbled back up towards the palace under skies whose stars were already beginning to pale. He told himself angrily that it was too easy to become obsessed with lonely work like this. Easier still to ruin it with impatience. Yet he still could not be sure he would find Kara there awaiting him, that he would not find the chest broken, the cloak gone, and nothing save perhaps a black quill left him as a token. Along high stair and vaulted passage his thoughts haunted him, and though his relief at finding her curled beneath the covers, her hair a dark corona amid the white pillows, was great enough, it barely lasted him into sleep, and fled with waking. On the next day he hurried through his duties in the shipyards like a man possessed. That carving haunted him like a persistent irritation, an itch in his mind. Even when he found himself dangling head down from a masthead to free a salt-encrusted block, rather than reeve a whole new set of tackle, he could not stop running over and over the patterns in his mind until they made him dizzy. He swung himself upright on the little platform, and to avoid looking straight down to the deck, he glanced out across the harbor, enjoying the cool breeze and the look of the town in late afternoon. Down here, walls were mostly half-timbered and lime-washed, or timbers laid clinker fashion and painted very much like those of his childhood village. Many had been repainted after the ravages of winter, and garlanded with flowers in hanging baskets and window shelves. They looked bright as toys clustered around the feet of the more august buildings of the upper town, in their rich shades of red and yellow stone. But inevitably, somehow, his glance was drawn across the lower rooftops again, towards the dark bulk, itself a little like a lowering anvil, that was the hall of his guild. His sight seemed to pierce through those walls and down towards those half-formed secrets they held. He cursed. The joy had gone out of the scene for him. The irritation had infected it, too. He hated what he was doing, yet it would not let him be. Moodily, he lobbed the useless block into a cluster of seagulls bobbing on the harbor waters, and watched them explode upwards, cursing and squalling just as he wanted to. Then he shrugged guiltily. It would not have amused Kara, that. One of them might even have been Kara, if he had not. Very slowly he inched out along the shrouds and slid down with gloved hands. His duty was done for the moment. He could get back to his carving once more. By late evening, it was complete. Carved surfaces more detailed and more delicate than any he had ever made till now. The living lock and feather he took and set among the patterns, and save for the hues of life, they were matched to perfection. He laid them apart, then swiftly turned to preparing the molds, lest in the warmth of the forge the wax should soften further and lose some tiny point of definition. By that much might its power be lessened. By so much might he lose what he fought to preserve. It was with the gentleness of love that his practiced fingers worked a soft slip of burnt and powdered chalk about the delicate shapes he had made, to take the finest possible impress of the pattern. Over that, he smoothed layer upon layer of clay, gradually firmer, till at last the prepared shapes could be maneuvered gently into position in his molding flasks, sprues carefully aligned with the openings, then encased and set to dry well away from the forge hearth and the furnace, lest the sudden heat should crack them. Now he brought the water thundering down, washed the clay from his stinging cuts, and set the bellows wheel spinning till the breath of the bellows roared through the coals like buried dragons. Then, with long tongs, he set the crucible of purified silver among them, and several of other rare metals for his chosen alloy. He sat by the maw of the furnace, humming idly under his breath, and watched its dulled surface gradually shiver with remembered heat and change into a flowing mirror. He remembered his tumble-down smithy among the salt marshes, these 10 years behind him, and the breadth of a land away, and the silver wires he had worked there for a sword hilt. Believing his craft lost to him, he had not sought to set within them any virtues, and yet they had absorbed something of his essential self and shown it him as an image of the marshland skies. A rushing of gray clouds, a sweep of rain and storm. Now he must make this silver do likewise. save that now he would determine the image, and the essence would not be his own. He began to sing to himself quietly, vague snatches of that new song, wordless still, or with only a single word, yet heavy with a meaning that was growing continually clearer. Firing the molds, he felt a chain of words take shape in his mind as the wax rushed molten from the sprue holes, spitting and flaming onto the coals, and after it the boiling water to clean them. He sat them at the edge of the fire and took a deep breath. Then he lifted the glowing crucible to the furnace door, and one by one, in careful order, tipped in the lesser metals. Some were to make the silver harder and more durable, some to add a slight spring to it, but others, added in merest traces, were to bear special virtues of their own. The heavy liquid hissed and seethed sluggishly as he stirred it with a long rod of steel, and all the while, listening carefully to the thin, high note of the coals, he sang the chant that had come to him. That swirling rhythm went well with the stirring, and the coils it awoke in the crucible's heart. In silver the shaping, enclosing, embracing, in silver a shield, ring of signs interlacing, set firm within silver the circle shall close. In silver the melting, in silver the blending, as ramparts of steel shut with moonlight defending. No call from without them may pass what they hold. Tiny droplets of metal spattered his hand. The rod grew hot through the rag he held it by. The furnace heat drew the skin taut over his cheekbones, cracked his lips, stung his eyes, yet still he sang, dry-tongued, till the last part of the alloy was added and the blend complete. As freely you flow now, a form shall enfold you, in cooling, coalescing, a pattern shall hold you, in shaping and firming, grow strong, yet grow fair. What now I trust to you, embrace it, enfold it, yet against yearning for change, against wandering, hold it, in case as in armor the heart that is torn. With frantic speed he threw his weight upon the great forge bellows, pumping them faster than could the water wheel, till the hill of coals glowed searing white at its summit, as if earth fires fed it indeed. Urgently he heaved out the crucible in the long tongs, white-hot metal slopping and sizzling against its flanks, and whirled it across from furnace to forge. It seemed to leave a trail like a falling starstone in the heavy air, and hissed onto the angry coals. The lock of hair and the feather he caught up, raised them to his lips a moment, then reached out over the fire to the crucible and dropped them in. A light plume of flame danced up, ghost-like, and they were gone. Gathering his strength, he took up the crucible once more, swung it around to the molds waiting on the forge rim, then cursed himself luridly. Fool that he was to try such a task without one forge hand at least, to steady the mold, to correct his aim, to vibrate out airlocks and bubbles, to warn him when it was almost full. Hideous difficulties loomed over him. One mistake. One only. There was no help for it now. Delay would only cool the silver further, make it harder to pour. He would have to reheat it, risk dissipating what he had set within it. And would he ever dare to replace it? Better at all events to have no forge hand hear what he must sing now. Gritting tooth on tooth, he tilted the heavy thing, saw a swelling of red at its rim, a fine thread falling, straight into the mouth of the mold. Steam whistled from the other sprue hole. He breathed again, and on that note he sang, clear and fierce, that older song his memory had taught him. Yet the words were new, and as he sang his hand never trembled. The thread of falling silver never wavered. Sheltered in silver by craft and by flame, be no more now drawn from me and captive again. As once you chose, choose to remain. Your own self shall enclose you more firmly than fetter or chain. Silver sprang and spat, and he swung the crucible away. But was a mold full? Or was it only an airlock which would leave a damaging flaw? Too late to tell. Already the mirrored meniscus was dimming. He must pour the other quickly before the silver cooled. This was worse. His arms aching with cramp, his fingers trembling with weakness. His head swam, but he sang the words clearly through the smoky air. A long age it seemed before the silver leaped and spattered down the flanks of the second mold, and so great was his relief that he all but dropped the crucible, and had to set it down at an awkward angle on the rim before coaxing the molds gently out of the coals. Even unshaped, that silver could be potent stuff. He would be safest making some other work of it as soon as possible, set with different virtues. Meanwhile, he left the molds on top of the coals to cool slowly as they did. That helped lessen stresses within the metal. Exhaustion burned in his back and arms, and suddenly the air choked him. He flung the air vents wide and collapsed by the forge, listening to the wind sigh in the passages of the stone. His head drooped on his breast. He jerked upright once, and then it no longer seemed worth the effort. His eyes were hot and sore. His head. Thunder crashed around him. Suddenly he was in many places, on a storm-wreathed tower top, a grim and night-bound forest, by a forge in a marshland hovel. Or was it in the mountains of the north? Then he knew where he was, shivering by a stone-cold hearth, with pounding upon his doors. Speechless, he stumbled up, his throat ashen as the forge. Something in his dreaming, a memory of other such summons, filled that sound with dread, made his hands clumsy on the heavy bolt. For a moment, the figure that stood there in the shadowy corridor, cloaked and hooded, seemed ominous. But he was shorter than Elof, short and rotund, and from beneath the travel-stained hood blazed a mane of red hair. Elof forgot all his alarm and seized the proffered hand. "Rock, my lad! So you're back, then?"
"Sorta looks that way, don't it?"
grunted Rock gracelessly. Elof looked at him narrowly. Though Rock was nominally a guildsman, he was seldom seen in the halls. There was no mystery about that. In the Southlands, he had been a respected master of his art. But what status had a smith here, skilled as he might be in the mechanics of his trade, who lacked the least trace of true smithcraft? The short man grimaced.
"You're the only waking soul in the place. And here's me just in the gate. All the hostelry is still shut up snug for the dawn. And me too dry with the dust of 20 roads to make the climb up to the palace."
Elof took the hint, and poured them both wine from a jug on a side table. Rock downed his in one gulp, and held the beaker out for more.
"Not bad," he wheezed. "Distinctly passable, in fact, though the suits got into it again. Don't your forge boy keep it covered up?"
Elof peered suspiciously into his own goblet. "I don't keep a forge boy anymore. I get the prentices in to help as I need them." Rock snorted.
"No wonder place is a mess, then. I've half a mind to take up my old post again. You're not fit to look after yourself. What's this that's got you out of your bed so early?"
He glanced at Elof from beneath his bristling brows.
"Or kept you out of it all night, huh? My, must be something good and juicy."
He squinted at the small molds, into the cold crucible.
Silver? Not stuff for the fleet, surely.
Hardly, smiled Elof. That's day labor. This is to be a gift, a surprise. So not a word of it, even to Marja.
Scant danger of that, grunted Rock. Smithcraft's not a thing we talk about. Jewelry least of all. Well, these molds look about ripe for cracking. Want a hand?
If you're not too weary, grinned Elof, striving not to let his misgivings show. But it would be a worse risk being seen to hide anything from Rock. He was no fool. And since he could see nothing of the craft within the metal, what harm was there? His stubby hands were every bit as deft as Elof's as they prized apart the metal shells and chipped at the crumbling clay within. Below lay the chalk, sintered now to the hardness of the rock it came from. But under Elof's impatient grip, its edges flaked away, and he shelled it like some strange fruit, catching his breath at the gleams of bright metal that showed through. He brought down a jar of corrosive from the high shelf and mixed a weak solution in water.
So,
said Rock, as they watched the chalk fizz and bubble away, revealing the clear outlines of the pieces.
Not bad at all. Neat as Marja could manage, or any other master jeweler I know. But that's no surprise. They the way you wanted them, then?
With great care, Elof hooked the gleaming pieces out of the cleansing bath, ran them a moment beneath the water chute and held them up, first to the red-tinged Duergar lantern, then to the thin light that was filtering down the air shafts. Yes, he breathed, seeing the intricate pattern of lock and feather wind its way around them without the tiniest flaw or bubble to break its inexorable course. Yes, they are. Indeed they are. They set a catch in his voice, for he had the true smith's love of all things harmonious and fair. Yet not only their perfection moved him, but the sight of the shimmers and flickers that to his eye darted this way and that in the metal, like fish below clear ice. With a friend's privilege, Rock reached up and plucked down one of the gleaming things, like rare fruit.
Bracelets, huh? But why open like that?
Elof smiled. Anklets, rather.
I see. So they'll fit over the foot. But won't they need hinges?
No. The natural spring of the metal. Rock nodded, and his powerful fingers closed around the thick ring of silver, narrowing the split. No! barked Elof, and wrenched the fair thing from his hand. Rock raised his eyebrows mildly, and Elof smiled in apology. After it's annealed, I was going to say, a long, slow heating and cooling to heal any inward stresses.
All right, grunted Rock. I wasn't going to risk closing it all the way anyway. Guessed you'd be wanting to work on the catch. Can't see how it'd undo as it is.
Elof shrugged. It's important they stay on securely. Rock grinned in wry agreement.
Fair enough. She's an active girl, your Kara. More active than most. You'd be wanting anything you gave her to fit close and stay close, all right.
Elof relaxed, trying not to show how shaken he had been. How vital it was that those clasps should close only at the right time and place, and in no other. It was a fell thing he had shaped here, in its way, but there was no help for it. He had only to think of her drawn back to Lohi's clutches to make it all worthwhile again. He balanced the anklets in his palm, and was startled to see blood on the metal. It was his. He had reopened some of the worst cuts when he snatched the thing back. Well, on the outside of the piece it could do no harm. He turned to wipe it away on a clean rag. Then he froze. On the outside? But he had paid little heed to his injuries earlier in the work. He could have bled at any point. Onto the wax, into the silver, the tokens. He could have added his own blood to that feather. There was no way he would ever be able to tell.
What's amiss with you now? Grunted Rock. You've a face on you the color of milk, and sour at that.
It's nothing. Just an effect. One that might turn out good or bad. I have no idea. He choked down his sudden flood of anxiety. There was always slight contamination when you touched something. A flake of skin, its natural oils. That mattered little, so why should this? And after all, could he really be bound up any more closely with Kara than he was? Might even strengthen the thing. He smiled wearily. I was really wondering. I've a fair amount of silver left that I'd like to find a use for. Do you have any notions? Rock fingered his stubbled chin.
Not just now, but then my mind's that muzzy. I've not slept. Something to help us on our jaunt south. That's a good an idea as I can hatch right now. Me for the palace, and some breakfast. And a bath. They should have the bathhouse warming nicely by the time I get there. You could use one after your labors. Set you up? Coming?
Elof considered a moment. Why not? But hear me. If Kara is there also, not a word of the gift, remember. He shut away the anklets in a secure cabinet of iron, and closed up the forge with as much care. Then they went together out of the guild halls and into the winding straits of the Northerners' Quarter, at whose heart the great building stood. A light spring rain was falling, making the scale-tiled house roofs shine, gurgling out of the open-mouthed dragon heads at their gable ends, or running in sheets down their wall timbers, cocked tight as ships with the figures brightly limed in red and black upon them. Little rivulets chattering down between the cobbles into the central gutter. Rock looked at the ships rolling at anchor, and up at the ornate weather vanes on the house roofs, and groaned.
Wind swinging about around the compass again. Clear dawn when I came in. Ah, well, that's spring for you. That'll give us an interesting time at sea, that will, just like always.
Elof grinned sympathetically. Rock was unhappily weak of stomach in a lively sea. You know, he remarked, watching the vanes creak back and forth over the tiles, that was no bad thought of yours. Something to help on the voyage indeed. I'll think on that. And so he did, even as they took their ease in the royal baths, stretching out weary limbs on the steam room slabs, and drifting in the heated pools. His mind dwelt on it still. Then friends and fellow courtiers came to join them, and later Marja and Kara, and the demands of the day took over his thoughts. His other, deeper concern he forgot entirely for that time, the matter of the blood. Yet, in the years to come, he had cause to remember it, and wonder if this petty accident might indeed have played a strange part in his fortunes. For to the effects of true smithcraft, say the annals of that day, it was ever hard to put any bounds, and never more so than in the hands of Elof, called Valentor. From that day forth he had in any case little leisure for thought. The day of departure was near, and his was the ultimate responsibility for all the work his helpers, men and Duergar had made ready. What spare time he had, he devoted to reforging the extra silver. He would leave nothing so perilous behind to suffer the whim of chance. This work was less subtle, for the forces of nature might be stronger than the turning tides of heart and mind. But it cost him much hard labor in sizing its pattern with mauls and chisels, and beating down an inlay of gold wire into the troughs thus made. He had chosen the complex pattern, coiling and intertwining in the Southland style, that represented Amakak, the sea devourer, embodiment of the terrors of the oceans. But it represented also their regality and strength, and as such it was the favorite emblem of the boldest corsairs, and fitted his purposes well. From time to time he would sing snatches of old fishermen's shanties he remembered from his youth in Assenby village, songs chiefly concerned with summoning fine weather and catches, simple but strong. More often, though, he whistled hard between his teeth as he worked, recalling the pipe whistles the sea-wise smiths of Norderney used to forge for mariners to summon up the breeze. And as often happened to him, a work he had started casually took hold of him, and ere it was finished he had set within it a surprising craft and strength. Such was the turmoil of those last days that he could not finish it till the very eve of the fleet's departure, checking its balance carefully on its steel mounting, and giving it a last buff and polish. It only remained for him then to gather up the tools he always traveled with, and close up his forge for the summer. Last of all, he took the anklets from their cabinet, and thrust them into an inner pocket. Then he locked the doors behind him, and hurried out and into the ways leading up to the palace. Seeing the sun was almost down, that night Kermorven was feasting all the mariners of the fleet, some 2,000 in all, at a great banquet of state that would fill all the wide halls of the palace, and he should attend. Not that it mattered much if he was late, but Kara might be anxious. As it was, they managed to make their entrance a few minutes before the king himself took his seat. Till then, the center of attention had been Ilse, queenly in white among her guard of thick-set Duergar. But Elof was uncomfortably aware of all eyes turning to Kara, for the beauty of her and the mystery, garbed in a gown of forest green and set about with the jewels he had made her. "Do you hear them stir down there at the cruise tables?" she whispered as they took their seats at the high table. "Do you know why? Folk from the west or the remote townlets, who have not seen me ere now, they turn to their neighbors and whisper, 'Is that not she, the strange one, the shape-shifter that he took from the Ice Witch? What is she in truth, and what is he, that he loves such a one?'" Elof chuckled, "And their wiser neighbors will answer that if they cannot see good reason, they must be blind, or fish-blooded. And for your inner self, they'll cite the courage you showed in freeing their king, the ways you've helped us on our journeys, scouted for us, healed for us, fought for us." "For you," she said quietly, clutching his hand beneath the table. And then to a flourish of music Kermorven entered, and as one the crews rose to cheer and stamp. He acknowledged the rowdy tribute with a quiet nod and a lifted hand, and moved smiling to take his place between Ilse on his right hand and Kara on his left. The feast began then, and it was a merry one, though neither long nor drunken. Kermorven wanted his crews fit on the morrow, and would have a severe way with any who were not. It was well before the middle hours when Elof and Kara made their way back to their apartments. As Kara laid aside her jewels, Elof opened the chest, took out the cloak, and made as if to drape it around her shoulders. But her own strong hands held his wrists, and she shook her head, smiling. "Do you keep it for me still? Pack it among your own gear, and give it me only at need. Take it back when that is past. I would not add to your worries on such a voyage as this." Elof's mouth quirked. He understood only too well that she was paying him back, very gently, for having asked it of her. He put aside the cloak and drew her to him, and the anklets he left in his pockets, without a further thought. But on the next day's dawning, when they went aboard the longship Prince Corentin, flagship of the fleet, at its anchorage in mid-harbor, Elof had his other work ready to hand. Kara, bare-legged, swung through the boarding port with a lithe grace. He clambered unsteadily after her, while the wherrymen swayed up their heavy packs to the deck. Together they made their way aft to the stern castle, where stood Kermorven, directing the disposition of his fleet. His clear voice was ragged and cracking with the effort of shouting orders. Messengers scurried this way and that about the gently heaving deck, and the signal flags fluttered like bright butterflies in the crowded harbor. He had no more than a glance to spare for the newcomers, and that of relief. They were the last aboard, for Elof had been carrying out some final refitting aboard other vessels. Already aboard with the king was Rock, and also Ilse, as she often was in these days. That was natural enough, in that she also was a ruler, seeking to establish and extend her realm in the Meneth Lendenin, and was hoping to bring many more of her folk eastward on this expedition. Only Elof, who had once by chance overheard a strange conversation, was inclined to wonder what more might lie behind this, and he kept his own counsel. She was leaning on the rail now, squinting in the morning light, regarding the confusion with her wide, sardonic grin. It broadened, if anything, when she saw Elof and Kara, and she waved them lazily over. "Scurry, scurry, scurry. Everyone's rushing about at the behest of their feelings, too busy to stop and think. That's men for you. Or humans. Eh, Lady Kara?" Elof stiffened slightly. He was very fond of Ilse. But what she thought of Kara he had never been sure, and this stress on humanity made him uncomfortable. In many ways, Kara was more human than the Duergar, and knew it. But Kara only smiled and took Elof's arm. "I find they have some uses, both of them. What's amiss here?" Ilse jerked a stubby thumb at the sternpost, where a gilded wind vane in the shape of a gull creaked to and fro, swinging with each slight shift of the ship. "The wind, it would seem. A few points short of favorable by the look of it. So we are windrowed, with scant space to maneuver. The small craft think they will clear the harbor mouth close-hauled. The larger longships and dromons fear they cannot. It is hard to be sure."
"And getting them out under oars could take all day," said Rock uneasily. "We could miss the wind and sit wallowing for hours."
He looked somewhat green already. Elof nodded, stepped forward, and tapped Kermorven unceremoniously on the shoulder. "Would it help you to have a true gauge of the wind?" he called out against the breeze.
"Would it not?"
snapped the tall man over his shoulder, brushing his bronzen hair out of his eyes.
"Why, can you shape us such a thing in time? It would help us to know whether to risk sail."
Elof reached into his pack. "I was going to give you this today anyway, as a luck gift for the journey." He handed the glittering quarter moon of metal to Kermorven. His brows lifted as he looked at it. Then he grinned to Elof.
"Amicak, eh? Well, we've sailed under his sign before, you and I. It shouldn't hurt us to play the Corsair again."
He reached up to the carved sternpost and lifted the golden gull from its socket. Into its place he slid Elof's vane. The raised finial that was the head of the pattern gleamed gape-jawed to the wind. "Once it takes the wind properly," called Elof hopefully, It should hold it tight with every twist and turn. He watched it saw from side to side a little, just like its predecessor. Then, there! The vane had stopped sharply, quivering slightly, gripped as if by vast hands in the dead center of the wind. Remarkable, said Kermorven, even though its tidings are not hopeful. What if it were pushed out of line? Elof shrugged. It should center itself once more, but it should not be so easily shifted. Curiously, Kermorven reached up and pushed at the blade of the vane. It did not move. He pressed again, and then harder, with a real effort. Like trying to close a door in a fierce gale, he gasped, though the breeze is no more than middling. He pushed with both hands and all his weight, and now, very slowly, the blade began to shift. And as it did, so Elof caught his breath, felt Kara's hand tighten suddenly upon his arm. A sudden chill grew in the pit of his stomach. Something else had shifted also. He knew not what, but it felt like the balance of the world. Ilse cried out suddenly and pointed, not to the vane, but to the streamers on the mainstays, the signal flags above. It was hard to see at first, but had they also shifted? Kermorven had released the vane, staggered back. It stayed where he had placed it, as firmly as before. He threw his weight upon it again, and once again the streamers shifted. The flags flapped to a different angle. Elof swallowed. That's all, panted the king, releasing the vane and doubling over, hands on knees. You, Elof, with your thews might shift it a fraction further, but no more. That's scant surprise, said Ilse a little shakily. To alter the wind at all. Winds are not a single thing, says our lore of weather, but a net of flows and currents, faster than the oceans. To shift one, in a few points, I cannot conceive of it. Nor I, muttered Rock. What have you gone and done this time, my lad? Elof could only shake his head, feeling like an idiot. Kermorven leaned back against the gunwales, waving off the messengers clamoring for his attention. Abruptly, very much the ruler. Elof, did you plan this? He asked with a grim quiet in his voice. Elof drew a deep breath. Kara's hand lay tight upon his shoulder, and somehow that gave him the wit to speak. I planned no more than I said. Now I see it, though. I can see something of how it came about. It is logic of a sort. I sang over it. I whistled old songs of the north to encourage sea luck, fair winds. They are part of me, those songs. They run deep in my memory. They must have drawn more out of me than I guessed. I never dreamed of giving it the power to compel. Kermorven nodded. I can believe that. It is a startling power, but perhaps also a dangerous one. My lord, cried one of the messengers suddenly, desperate to be heard. The Dromans are all signaling. The wind has changed. It will serve them now. In the longships, called another. My lord, we may lose the hour, the tide. Kermorven snapped to his feet. Well, he muttered, what that power has already given us, let us not waste. And cupping his hands to his mouth, he shouted out to his crew.
To your places, all men. Winch and cable crews ready. Mainmast men ready. Slip the stern moorings. Hoist the mainsail. Ready the head sails. Bow moorings. Haul in.
Tumult broke out on the main deck, and the shipmaster and his mates came running aft to the stern castle. Kermorvan rounded on the messengers with a blast of orders that sent them scurrying to the signal halyards. Then back to his own crew.
Do you take command, master. Wrap her around into the wind, mainsail first. Out into the main channel and through. We'll lead them all out.
The shipmaster saluted him, and turned to bellow across the decks. In the bows, a capstan winch began to clank, and they felt the stern swing suddenly free of its moorings. The long hull began to sway and sidle in the choppy harbor waters. The huge mainyard creaked and rumbled up the mast. The hemp-stiffened mainsail fluttered and boomed as the breeze caught it and shook it.
Keep hauling the bows,
bellowed the master. Into the wind swung the great ship, and for the space of a breath the mainsail hung limp. Then it was across, and almost at once the wind caught the sail, bellied it out with an explosive crack.
Slip the moorings, the bows, roared the master. Helm, steer for the harbor mouth.
The great ship surged forward. The deck leaped under them and then began to dip and raise more smoothly as it gathered way. Behind them, the wheel spun, hauling on the tiller lines that rose up taut through the deck. Kermorvan cast a glance at the helmsman, who nodded calmly. This manner of rudder was a new thing, learned from the Duergar, and still unpredictable. But it seemed to be working smoothly enough now. The Prince Cornton nosed her sleek bows out into the main channel, while all around her sails blossomed out among the other ships of the fleet, and their standards dipped in salute. Kermorvan gathered up his armor of black and gold from the bench where he had laid it, and moved forward to stand at the rail of the stern castle, proud and resplendent. He wore no helm, and his long locks shone like bronze indeed in the morning sun. From the walls of the palace came a fanfare of trumpets, the call of the garrisons who would remain to defend the town. From tower tops, a loud pealing of bells, and from the shore, a great cheer went up. As ever, all the town had turned out to watch their king and his great fleet depart. He waved, and from the bows his own heralds answered the town's salute. Then, at his command, the rest of his music, gathered by the companionway, struck up a strong and buoyant tune. Like sudden wings, the head sails spread out above. White water swirled at the bows. Kara, still clutching Elof's arm, positively danced with excitement as the great ship swept towards the harbor mouth, its fellows sliding out one by one into its wake in the order the king had laid down. As it glided between the tall towers that flanked the mouth, the music of the other ships took up the tune, and the notes of thundering tabors, shrilling flutes, silver cymbal and brazen horns and trumpets rose and rang around the whole shore of the bay, as their white sails spread out, dazzling against its sparkling waters. Thus, in pride and splendor, that great fleet set forth, and though from shore it must have been no less splendid a sight, no account describes it so. Those who chronicled it were among its numbers. Hard on the flagship's heels the greatest of the dromons came, still spreading its great fields of sail. The creak of ropes, bellowed orders, the dull boom of sailcloth shook the air. Flanking it raced two smaller craft, chase cutters rigged in the strange new patterns derived from Duergar ideas, their sails slanting fore and aft instead of square to the hull. Kara went running to the stern rail to watch them, bouncing and skipping impudently up through the wake like puppies snapping at the ankles of a bull. "They're so beautiful," she breathed. "If we could only sail one of those." Elof laid his arm around her. "There'll be time enough on this voyage. No doubt their crews will be glad of the rest for a day or two. We should ask Kermorven." "Oh, yes," she said, her eyes sparkling like the waters beneath. He felt her quiver from head to toe with excitement. "So fat, so light, so fast. It would be almost like—" But there she stopped herself and said no more. As in previous years, the first few days of the Great Fleet's voyage were leisurely, more like a ceremonial royal progress than a venture of moment. By day, the ships would race each other, or contest in maneuvering and skill, which Kermorven encouraged for the practice it gave crews and commanders alike. Elof and Kara had their chance then to sail the new rigged cutters. Each night they would anchor in sheltered waters, or the harbors of lesser ports where the king would receive deputations and petitions, settle disputes, and renew acquaintance with those of his people who seldom or never came north to Morvenhall, the city itself. In the remoter areas, the fleet was greeted with almost delirious relief, as a living token of the strength and solidarity of the land. The wounds of the Ekwesh occupation, short as it had been, were slow in healing there. Those were pleasant days for most, yet for Elof they were marred. For Kara grew more restive, spoke less, and seldom settled. She would pace the decks, or sit for long hours in the bows, gazing at the empty expanse of the ocean off the port bow. She did not object to his company in such times. She would smile at him as he came to sit by her, perhaps rest her head upon his shoulder, yet ever her gaze was turned away into the void of earth and sky. Once he found her still there in the midst of a storm, clinging to the forestay and squealing with delight as the bows clove the wave crests and showered her with chill spray. He grew angry then, and upbraided her for courting foolish perils. She made no comment, no complaint, but took to climbing, in clement weather, to the lookout's place at the summit of the mainmast. Elof followed her up, admiring the grace of her tanned legs on the rigging above, the animal ease with which she swung herself up onto the narrow platform. Elof bent and struggled through more cautiously, and once he hastily looped his belt through the ring provided. Kara took no such precaution, but leaned out over the rail, rejoicing in the feeling of height and pointing down delightedly to the flocks of dolphins come to race around the fleet's bows. Elof smiled, only a little thinly, and sought to share her joy without looking too often at the deck. He found himself too ready to notice how distant it seemed, and how narrow, how unsteady, even wildly back and forth beneath him on a surface of churning green and white. But if he studiously ignored that, the view was worth it. And so was the sense of space after many days cramped and confined aboard ship. He felt a sudden pang of sorrow for Kara. She had come of her own will. She would say nothing. Yet if her life on land was confining, how much worse must this be? "Would you like your cloak back?" he asked impulsively, forgetting his other concerns for now. "Without obligations. So you can—" He shrugged. "Take the air whenever you wish. As you wish." She leaned on the rail, her crisp dark hair ruffled by the wind and tinged with a corona in the clear light, and looked at him speculatively for a while. Then she smiled, shook her head again, and put her head affectionately on his arm. "No need. This is enough for me, to feel the rushing airs and see afar, far." I'll wait till you need me." Elof shrugged again and took her arm, but within himself he felt slightly resentful. She was still paying him back, it seemed. He glanced at her, watching those fierce bird-like eyes, green as the water beneath, flicker this way and that across the vast horizon, and was suddenly glad she had not accepted. What could he have been thinking of? Dislike it though he might, his chosen way would be the safest after all. It was not long after that they passed beyond the southern borders of the realm of Morvenhall, and into the wild, beyond the habitations of men. Yet still it was a rich and wholesome country along the shores, well watered by many rivers, and they were able to land for water and provisions at many anchorages they had charted and explored upon previous voyages. The worst perils here were wild beasts, and an occasional nest of human outlaws many times more savage, ready to sally out and assail any small vessel in difficulties or separated from the body of the fleet. Kermorven had taken strong measures to guard against this, however, and such attacks were swiftly dealt with. On one occasion, such a straggler was attacked by 2 pirate longboats in fog. Kermorven brought the Cornton alongside with sweeps and himself led the clearing of its decks. Out of some 30 raiders, no more than 3 escaped him, and that by leaping overboard, swimming for a boat, and rowing frantically off into the shadows. "Were it clear, I would have pursued them in the cutters," he remarked, wiping clean his gray-gold sword. "As it is, let them save their hides, if only for the sake of times past." At last, after some 3 weeks of generally easy sailing, they came to the last of these anchorages and the greatest, a wide river estuary that was of old named Ancarvadoen, the Deep Roads. Beyond it the coasts became rougher, stonier, dangerous in the approach. No voyage had passed without the loss of one vessel at least along this stretch, many lives. Nor were the lands they guarded any safer. Somewhere at their heart stretched the long arm of the great forest, turning to tangled jungle with its manifold traps and terrors. And Carvadoin was remembered in this uninhabited country chiefly because it was known that the last great band of fugitives from doomed Morven, led by Vade and the Princess Ase, had encamped here through one long winter. On the last voyage, men of the fleet had stumbled upon the traces of that brief settlement, a few overgrown hummocks of dry stone walls, and upon the hill overlooking the estuary, 3 or 4 graves, well marked, but nameless. It was a melancholy place, but Kermorven wished to land there once more. He had brought with him memorial stones fairly carven for the graves and the ruins. "And may they lay the unquiet spirits of this land," he remarked quietly to Elof, as the 2 of them clambered back down the steep grassy slopes to their shore camp. "For I feel they walk here still, or some memory of their sorrows. Let them learn this, that their suffering was not wholly without result, that the line and heritage of their land lives still, and does not forget them." Elof nodded. "I sense something of what you say, strongly. It is wholesome enough, this land, but overhung with feeling, anguish, sadness, loss, and beneath it anger, rage at the injustice of fate. I have felt it somewhere before, in the hollow bones of Morven the city, perhaps. And not only there. I do not think those stones will assuage it, worthy notion though they were. It does not bode well." "I agree. And in any event, We are on the edge of difficult and dangerous country, and a treacherous coast. He looked at Kara, tripping lightly through the tangled grass where others slipped and stumbled. I think it is time we called upon your unique gifts, my lady. If you are willing, you could scout out our way on the morrow for many leagues ahead. She looked demurely at her feet. If Elof is willing, my lord, then, of course. He does not normally raise any objection, said Kermorven quizzically, glancing at Elof. No? Then, whenever it pleases you, my lady. I'll fetch your cloak from the ship then, Kara, said Elof, a little self-consciously. You can be getting something to eat meanwhile. He hurried off, feeling the king's gaze like a cool gust at his back. When his boat came back to the beach, he could see her waiting there for him, a slender silhouette against the glow of the campfires, half hidden against the shadows of the bushes around them. I have it, he said quietly, stepping up to her, holding out the precious garment. She received it in her outstretched hands, held it, did not put it on. Kara, he began. Heart, why the reluctance? Why do you hesitate? Why have you twice refused this already? Is it because? Are you only delaying the moment? Do you think you'll fly away and never come back? No, she hissed, and then more softly, no, Heart, I will come back. Never fear, but I will come back. He nodded, took the cloak from her hands, and himself draped it around her shoulders. Then he reached into his pocket. I believe that is what you truly want. I have brought you a small token, keepsakes. Wear them for me, and you will not forget. Swiftly, he stooped to her ankle, one open band of silver in each powerful hand. He felt the first slide over her cool skin. Then his wrists were seized. Elof was stronger than most men, but he could not move a finger's breadth against the strong, slim fingers that gripped him thus, that drew his hands up and into the light. He saw the glint of silver mirrored in the chill green pools that were Kara's eyes, and to his horror, the shimmering that ran within the silver also, as bright as ever he saw it himself. Fool! Said a voice of steel he hardly recognized. Oh, you unalterable fool! Do you think a power had sunk so low in loving a man that it should be blind to the forces within his works? Did you dream I donned your arm ring that day in ignorance of what it would do? That I would not see through this silver of yours as into clear water, and read there what you have set in play? Did you think so little of my life, my existence, to trifle with it thus? He saw the streaks of silver that coursed her cheeks, and his heart withered within him. I sought only to reinforce our own truest wish, steady you by your own will. The steel broke and burst into flame. By ensnaring that will, by goading it along the paths you choose. I sought only to embody what I knew you wanted. I set no compulsion of mine in the work. No more than you would compel the winds, and yet you did, and shackled them with fearful force. Can you not see that you cannot harness any desire of mine? Only as your own eyes see it can you give it form. But, Elof swallowed, If it is so close to yours, if it is what you want, then how can it harm you? If you truly love me, how should it mar that? How? She laughed, but not as humans laughed. By taking away what is most truly mine. How would it harm you to be whipped to breathe, beaten to eat, goaded to love? How would it harm you if Kermorven drew Smithcraft from you by prison and torment, not friendship and honor? Then, my cunning child, my deceitful heart, then you would understand. She lifted his wrists, shook them fiercely before her face, and the rage of Morgannon shone there behind the tears. And how would it mar love by forcing it to tread one single path, one circling, spiraling, endless path, never free to change, to grow, to find new ways and new reasons to love. Love of all things, that must change from moment to live. That you would keep for yourself, aye, but never trust me with it. Must I be the same to you in age, when you will not be the same? Be to you then just what I am now, no more, no less? How fine a lover will you find me then? Fool, how fitting company for your cooling blood. Yet to that you would bind me, shackle me in my own imprisoned spirit, encircle me about in the mazes of my own mind. You would deceive me, drive me by my very feelings, just as your damned mind sword drove men by their deepest fears. A sudden shock drove deep into Elof's breast, as cold and breath-devouring as that blade's bite. He clutched at the scar, remembering that older song, that tune that had arisen unbidden from his memory, as it seemed. He knew it now, knew the first words he had ridden upon its rising fervor. As sundered I found you in flickering flame, as once then I bound you, I bind you again. Over the mind sword, embodiment of command, compulsion, driving by terror, over the last completion of that unhallowed weapon, on the fixing of its cutting edge, he had sung that song. And he had sung it again over the instrument of his love. A new flood of fury filled her, overflowed in tears. And the risk? How could you? What if those anklets had closed, other than on me? What then? And if they were ever opened again? You, who broke Lohid's fetters on me. How I loved you for that. And then you sought to fetter me within myself. Now, Elof wept also, as he had not even in childhood. Tears of shame and rage and scalding self-disgust. His own vast folly billowed up before him like a banner of blackness, and blindly he reached out to her through its enveloping folds. Tara, I see now, If he could reach her, hold her, tell her how much he had been at fault, then she might still forgive him. His hand clutched at her arm, closed around metal over warm skin. "Don't touch me!" she screamed, and with that astonishing strength, she jerked away her arm. The metal caught in his desperate fingers. He felt it bend and break. Then the darkness seemed blasted from his eyes, and he was staring at her, and she at him, wide-eyed with shock, unsteady on her feet. She was holding her arm as if injured. On the dark grass between them, a shard of gold gleamed, a curved, distorted shape, and from between her fingers a broken end gleamed. The serpentine arm ring of gold, Elof's first great work, his first gift to her and sign of hope between them, had broken in two. She stumbled back a pace, and even as he reached out to her once again, she threw back her head and screamed aloud, a terrible shriek of grief and despair that echoed out around hill and water like the feelings that haunted them given fearful voice. All in that camp or aboard the ships, awake or sleeping, it brought instantly to their feet, hearts pounding, ridden by fear beyond thought and reason. Before those who had seen them, the empty wastes of Townlaw opened out once more, the withered lands, so the winds might cry there, with the voice of the imprisoned dead. So they might have stirred the cloak about her, so billowed it forth to reveal its inner blackness. Shadow enveloped her. She sprang and vanished. Wings of shadow beat upward into the night. With a cry of horror, Elof snatched the Tarnhelm from his belt and clapped it on his head. The cry changed in mid-breath to the scream of an eagle, and into the heights he soared in her pursuit. There was starlight enough over the ocean for his keen eyes to pick out the black swan flying seaward, high and straight, never wheeling, never turning. After her he sped, feeling his wings bite into the wind. His keen head crested it like a speeding swimmer. Yet she flew fast, that strange creature, and even in seconds she had a lead on him he would find hard to break. And time was on her side. Far into the night they flew, till the land was no more than a streak of shadow far behind. Elof had looked back once, and dared do so no more, for the distance it had cost him. He was no nearer now than at the first, and already he could feel himself tiring, his masked form yearning for the lineaments of a man once more. Never once did he see her neck turn. Did she even know she was being followed? So fast, so straight she flew, it made little difference. He had no voice to call her, and the call of his heart was emptiness. He had betrayed her, and brought about what he had most dreaded. What more could he do for her now but fly in her path till he reached its limits, or those of his failing strength? One way or another, he would find an end. How far he flew, he never remembered, or for how long. But at some point, some shred of sanity must have asserted itself, for his friends of the fleet found him at last, in the small hours of the morning, sprawled face down and soaking upon the tidal sands of Ancarvadoin. They feared him dead at first, but he breathed, and in one hand the Tarnhelm was clutched, with a grip they could not break. All right, guys, we reached the end of Chapter 2, and that is going to do it for story time this evening. I hope you enjoyed chapters 1 and chapters 2, where we find what an idiot Elof really is. Couldn't he have just trusted her? But no, he sought to try to enslave the woman that he says he loves. Out of fear. Let this be a lesson to all of us. If you hold on too tight to something and leave it unchanging, that thing may slip out of your grasp. Poor Elof. Well, we'll get into the next chapters on our next story time, which will be next Tuesday. Tomorrow, we have Bloodlords, a Pathfinder adventure in Foundry VTT. That is my campaign, so I will be running that one. And so come along and join in and have some fun and listen to Bloodlords as it goes along. And then, of course, Thursday, we'll be back to Stompy Mech Night. So thank you to all of you. The greatest gift that you can give to a streamer, it's a gift of your time. And I appreciate that you guys gave me the gift of yours this evening. Whether it was for 5 minutes or 3 hours. Whichever, thanks so much for having been here. I will be having these 2 chapters posted onto my YouTube channel a little bit later this week. I may try to get it done this evening, but if I don't get it up this evening, it will be up by later this week, so you can catch the beginning of the Hammer of the Sun if you happen to miss chapters 1 or any part of chapter 2. I do stream this onto my YouTube channel as well. I put up just the chapters as I read, but I do live stream this there as well. So if you're ever here and you're like, oh shoot, ads keep on showing up, because Twitch will of course put ads up, you can flip over to the YouTube channel, watch it there, and I don't believe there's any ads. And you can also, like videos, subscribe over there. It's free and helps me to grow my channel. I hope you guys all have yourselves a wonderful evening and a fantastic day until I see you again. Good night, everybody.